ChessDiagnostic.
Hello everybody and welcome to ChessDiagnostic. I've been in a mood to study some classic games lately, and I'm going to go through a game between Wilhelm Steinitz and Curt von Bardeleben. Now this is Steinitz' classic Immortal game, and it really follows a classic attacking pattern of a king stuck in the center. Of course it's Black's fault, but he allowed it and Steinitz ripped him apart. It starts with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5. So we get the Giuoco piano, or the Italian game after c3. Now after knight to f6, the standard move these days is d3, just protecting the d4 pawn and preparing normal development and castling. Of course, it's not these days. This was in 1895, so we get d4, pawn takes, c takes d. Now after the bishop checks, Steinitz plays knight to c3. And as you can see here with the arrow, I was analyzing this line. It looks like after knight takes on e4, well, that's actually the line of the game, but after knight takes e4, the bishop will take the knight, and Black ends up with just a clear pawn, and with the most accurate play, Black keeps the pawn, and there's really no counterplay. So this line is not played anymore these days. But instead we get d5 immediately, which is really a huge mistake, because after e takes d, knight takes, you could see that this e file is open, and if Black doesn't play accurately, then he's going to suffer quite a strong attack. Castle, and here's where Steinitz's opponent starts to go wrong. So instead of simply castling and consolidating his position, he tries to develop a little more, but after the bishop comes out and he brings his bishop back, of course he should have just played queen here, and then he could have even castled queenside eventually after f6, or just castle kingside. He tries to complicate things by bringing his bishop back. So Steinitz, after bishop takes knight, if you look at here, of course if the bishop takes here, he can still just take on e6, f takes, and then with d5 we get an interesting variation with rook to e1. Again, the piece can come back, but Black has a very difficult position to defend with his king stuck in the center. We don't get that line. Instead, we get the bishop takes, knight takes, and now after all these pieces are traded, the simple rook to e1, let me turn this engine off here, the simple rook to e1 keeps Black from castling. It's just one tempo, one move, but it's enough for Steinitz to develop a massive attack. So he plays f6 to try to give a square for his king to relieve the pin, and now actually the most accurate move here is queen to a4. So after the queen moves back with queen to b4, Steinitz will win a clear pawn because he's threatening rook takes check and then to pin the queen. A very accurate continuation, and that's long been known from analysis. So if the king moves, the queen takes the pawn, knight moves, and then the queen simply moves back, and all these fractured pawns, as well as just being a pawn down, will lead to pretty quick win for Steinitz. We don't see this line in the game. Instead we see queen to e2, just simply stacking up on that knight. So the queen moves back, and now we get Steinitz playing rook from a to c1. So the idea of this move is just to activate his rook and eventually bring it into play, but it's a little slow, and Black could have just relieved the pin with king to f7, and he would have had a fighting chance. But we get a further mistake by black with c6. He thinks he has time to kind of close off this c file, but the problem is there's a brilliant positional and tactical idea by Steinitz, and all he needed was one extra move to achieve it. So c6 allows Steinitz that extra move. If you want to pause the video and try to guess it, it involves this knight here. So notice that the queen, the rooks are all as active as possible. The only issue is this knight really has no squares because of the f6 pawn, and he can't really come in this way. It's a little too slow. So he plays d4 to d5. Now the idea of this move is to vacate the d4 square, and because the knight and the queen can't take, the pawn takes, it also opens the c file. So maybe that was his underlying idea of rook from a to c1. He was foreseeing d5. So after the pawn takes, we get knight to d4. And now there's all kinds of problems for black. The knight's going to come in to e6 with the rook coming in as well. And we also have ideas after knight to e6 of the queen coming in and causing checkmate threats. So let's see what happens. King to f7, knight to e6, not a surprise. Computer's suggesting the knight could have moved, possibly a better move, but instead we get rook from h to c8, contesting the c file. But the problem with that is it leaves the black king side weak. Now it looks like we can check here, but actually that doesn't solve anything because the king could just move back. Instead we get a much stronger move with queen to g4, threatening the g7 pawn as well as a discovered check attacking the queen. So after black protects the g7 pawn with g6, we get that discovered attack, or discovered check with knight to g5. Now if the pawn takes, he just lost his queen, game over. The king has to move back onto this e file, stuck in the center again. What do you think the next move is? It's a very forcing move, and this is why this game is the Immortal. We get rook takes, e7. Now the computer is suggesting queen takes, but after we trade all these pieces and the queen, Steinitz just moves his knight back. It's a very easily won endgame with an extra piece. So we don't get that line. Black doesn't give up that easily. After rook takes e7, we get a rather comical position. Now notice if the king takes, we get kind of a complicated line, but with queen to b4 and rook to e1 check, we actually get an amazingly beautiful checkmate with this line here. Well, that's not the line. Let's see here. So alright, well I guess that is the line I analyzed. He would just give up and we'd end up with a queen versus a rook. There's another line I was looking for later, and we'll see it here. Alright, so if the king takes, we get checkmate, but instead he moves over, and we still can't take this queen because the rook is threatening on here. So for example, take here, we'll get a checkmate. Black will get a checkmate. Instead we get this position where he keeps checking. The queen and the king can't take. If the king takes, we take the queen with check. And actually at this point, Black resigned, or I guess he just left the game from what I read in history. But if we look at here, this is where the beautiful checkmate comes in. So he checks here again. The queen forces. An amazing checkmate. This would actually be a checkmate here. Another line I analyzed. Now if the king moves back to here, we get queen check, knight check. And I guess this was the mate in 10 that Steinitz announced that he saw from rook takes e7. An amazingly beautiful game, and there's so many variations that I analyzed and checked. Really, I just showed you a few of them. It would take all day to really go through every variation of this game, but I hope you enjoyed these classics, and I'll probably be covering more evergreen and immortal games, just because really I think they're the backbone of your chess understanding, even if they do contain a ton of mistakes, especially at the amateur level. They'd still crush us just because of their tactical ability, and there's a lot to learn from. So I hope you enjoyed this game, and I'll see you in the future. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for future videos. See you in the future.